Buenos días. Es un honor y placer estar aquí con ustedes. I'm Andrea Guerrero, and I am here to tell you a story that has launched an evolution of human rights movement work in San Diego and hopefully far beyond. On May 28th of 2010, a community member of ours, Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, was killed by border agents. He was deported, which is easily done when you live undocumented, as he had for more than 3 decades in San Diego without papers and no pathway to get them. He was deported and he attempted to walk back to be with his family, his 5 U.S. citizen children and his wife. And in his crossing, he was apprehended by Border Patrol agents who described him as being uppity. He looked them in the eyes. He spoke up. He asserted his rights. And every time he did that, he was brutalized. He was brutalized when he was asked to throw away his water and he poured his water out. And that justified the border agents in kicking out his leg and injuring him. He asserted his medical rights, his right to medical attention, and that was used as a justification for agents to take him down to the border to attempt to forcibly remove him without giving him medical attention. And there they began to beat him. They began to tase him. When he writhed in pain from that tasing, they used that as a justification to tase him further and then to kneel on his neck, much like police officers did with George Floyd, put him into a positional asphyxiation situation where he stopped breathing. There were 17 agents involved in this incident. None of them have been held accountable. Anastasio died without pants. He stopped breathing, I should say, because he died a few days later. Pants that had been removed, presumably to humiliate him. He was handcuffed, prone, face down on the ground when all of this was happening. And the pants that were later recovered had a Know Your Rights flyer in his back pocket. As part of the community, he had been trained on how to assert his dignity. And when he did, he was killed for it. That was the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 began as soon as he stopped breathing, when border agents went up onto the pedestrian bridge. All of this happened at the port of entry in San Isidro, which is in San Diego. And there were many witnesses. They went up onto the pedestrian bridge and they began to erase the cell phone videos of the bystanders. And then they dispersed those witnesses. There was one brave witness who walked away with her video intact and called me the next day. And she told me she had witnessed a murder. It took her some number of years, 2 to be exact, to be willing to come forward with that video because she thought, if federal border agents could kill a man in broad daylight, what are they going to do to me, a young woman? The police investigation into this case named Anastasio as it was a homicide case, homicide, death by another. They named the suspect as Anastasio, the deceased, and they named the victims as the border agents. That's how the whole police investigation was set up. The investigation was concluded roughly 6 weeks after the incident, before the video was revealed. And once the video was revealed, it was never reopened. That investigation, that police report became the basis for not only the decision not to prosecute out of San Diego, but the decision not to prosecute by the Department of Justice, the decision not to impose any accountability within the agency of Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection. And in all respects, there was no accountability in this case. No one has apologized to the family. No one has been held to account. In the intervening years, this happened in 2010. In the intervening years, more than 250 other men, women, and children, some of them U.S. citizens, some of them migrants, some of them travelers, have been killed by border agents. In the 100-year history of our border agency, no agent has ever been held accountable for what we can only presume are many thousands of people who have been killed. None, zero. In those same 12 years that have passed, now almost 13, there have been more than 12,000 men, women, and children, mostly Black and brown, who have been killed by local and state law enforcement in the United States. The root cause of all of this violence, all of this abuse, and the impunity that has ensued has been the low standard for use of force. The international human rights standard is necessary and proportionate, and the standard here in the United States is objectively reasonable. Anastasio's case before the Inter-American Commission is the first ever case of an excessive use of force case by police agencies or law enforcement agencies in a case against the United States before the Inter-American Commission. We were very fortunate to have a hearing in November, and we are now awaiting decision. This case is a landmark case, and it has the potential to change the game in the United States. This is a real live example of bringing human rights home, of using international human rights standards, principles, norms, obligations, and applying them to the violence that we experience in our country. It would have an effect not only on what happens with border agents, but all other law enforcement agents in the country at every level of law enforcement. I want to tell you a little bit about how this case has evolved the way we think about the work that we do in San Diego. We have learned so much from our partnership with the UC Berkeley Law School. Our guide and mentor, Roxana Altholz, who is the co-director of the International Human Rights Clinic there, who said early on to me, using international instruments, especially through the Inter-American Commission, it is about the journey, not the destination. It's not about the final day when you get a decision. It's about elevating, claiming, and protecting human rights at every stage of this fight. Every testimony given, every filing we did, every action we took, we used it as an opportunity to elevate human rights in our community. So much so that now we describe ourselves, Alliance San Diego, we once described ourselves simply as a community organization. We are now a community-based human rights organization, and we are in the midst of evolving in real time the work that we're doing to launch a human dignity campaign, recognizing that Anastasio died because he asserted his dignity. And dignity, we have come to understand, is the why of our democracy. Dignity is the why of our democracy. And we're fighting for an inclusive democracy. That means one where everyone can exercise their dignity, all of us. So we're really excited to be here and talk to you all about how to bring human rights home, because we're doing it in real time. And we are looking to do community education around human rights and give people real tools, not just to engage the US federal government, but to engage local and state government as well. You know, how do we train people to see the dignity that they have within themselves, which we are coming to realize is a little bit more complicated than we thought. When you have been oppressed and been treated as lesser than for so long, it's easy to talk about the golden rule and how you treat others, but how do you talk about your own dignity, and how do you have the courage and conviction to stand up for that dignity the way Anastasio did when he stood up and he asserted his right to dignity and died because of it. We're blessed to be working with his wife, his widow, Maria Puga, who has become a human rights defender in her own right, and with many other people. Anastasio's case is not the only case. There's so many cases. The more recent cases of Tyree Nichols, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd are all part of the same story. But if these cases changed the narrative, especially the case of George Floyd, if George Floyd's case changed the narrative, the Anastasio case has the potential to change the game, to ask a different question. Change the question that we ask when there are law enforcement killings. It shouldn't be about whether that was reasonable or not, which centers the law enforcement officer. It should be about whether it was necessary or proportionate, which centers the life that's at risk. And that is a fundamental pivot in how we think about these issues. We're losing more than 1,000 people every single year to law enforcement violence with very little to no accountability. The Anastasio case is one opportunity to change the game. And, you know, I would call to all of you who are not already in the game of domesticizing international human rights to get in the game because we have to change it. We have to change how we think about human rights, how we use human rights, and we have to believe that it is possible to make change through them. And I think our own experience through this case is a testament to some of the change that has already happened. We're not just waiting for the decision. We are waiting for the decision. We hope the decision comes at the end of this year or sooner, but we are also leveraging that in conversations in Congress. And I think it's fair to say that every oversight committee in Congress knows the name of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas and knows what that case stands for, which is dignity, which is why we're here to learn more, share more, be in community with all of you to change the game. Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for this great panel, but a special shout out to Andrea for not giving up on Anastasio. Thank you. 13 years is a long time. My name is Cynthia Buiza. I'm with the California Immigrant Policy Center. And what I wanted to say is I come from the social movements in the Philippines. And one of the challenges of the civil societies there is the outsized role that American society plays in their imagination, because it is one of the biggest providers of foreign economic aid. So even with civil society work and holding the excesses of the US accountable, it's a struggle. I guess my question, especially for members of civil society in the panel, as well as in the room, is where do we begin, right? It is in itself a struggle to even enforce some of our own principles of civil rights in this country. But with this concept, I know Jim said earlier, let's demystify the legal frameworks around human rights. What kind of narrative infrastructure should we be building so that we can also capture the imagination of the American people and our allies in this pivot towards holding power accountable in this country? And of course, countries that are now emerging as soft or strong authoritarians, and you know what these are.
That's a great question, Cynthia. And I can share what we're doing as an example. I think you don't have to be a lawyer and you don't have to be operating at the national or international level to be asserting human rights. So that's our work, to socialize human rights so that we can claim them. We cannot claim what we do not see as self-evident truths or we do not understand. The way I approach folks here in this country about human rights is I talk about the original human right in this country, which is in the Declaration of Independence, the self-evident truth that we are endowed by our Creator, known by many names, with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That became the basis for the beginning of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And we fell short 15 years later when we put together a constitution that did not fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence. But we start there and understanding that we domestically had the opportunity to fulfill those rights right away, but we didn't. We are now 75 years from the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We, as a community-based human rights organization, read all 30 rights in the Declaration. We are in the process of reading the American Declaration, all of us, so that when we go into city council or school board meeting or whatever, then we begin We begin by saying what we know to be self-evident truths and what has been recognized by the world of nations, which is our right to life, our right to education, our right to housing, etc. And it's been 75 years, and that promise has not been fulfilled. Marking that date, this is a great year with the 75th anniversary to bring human rights home here to the United States.
Hello, my name is Donna. I'm with Alliance San Diego. I actually have two questions. My first question is for Andrea Guerrero. What do you think will happen? What do you think is the impact of the ruling that will happen of the Estacio case? How do you think it'll impact the force of power that's been used by police officers and enforcement law?
Yes, so we don't know what the decision will be in the Anastasio case, but the process itself, as I said before, it's the journey, not just the destination. The process itself has already started to change the fight. It's changed the fight from, being one about simply holding people accountable to changing the game so that systemically we have a chance to hold people accountable. Until and unless we change the use of force standard in the United States so that aligns with international human rights standards, we're always going to be fighting a reasonable standard that centers the officer instead of the life at risk, right? So I think it is incumbent on civil society and lawyers to use these tools, to claim these tools, right? That's why, like, we're about to launch a campaign, a 3-part campaign: elevate human rights, claim human rights, and protect human rights. And Anastasio is a great example of that. We had to understand what those rights were. I didn't understand what those rights were. I had to call on the cavalry at UC Berkeley Law School to help. And once we understood them, then we claimed them. So we said to the family, look, the road did not end when there was no prosecutions. We have another vehicle. Let's learn together. Let's use it. And now we want to share that process, because regardless of what the decision is at the Inter-American Commission, we are leveraging the process into change in the United States. We're not, we have to rethink how we think about the international processes. I've had to learn this myself. It's not a domestic law enforcement imposing verdicts situation. It's leverage, it's power. And we've been talking about that all day, right? It's leverage and power. And that's what we're doing. When we elevate, claim, and seek to protect human rights, ultimately by codifying them into our laws at the local, state, and federal level, we are building power. And it will only happen if we build power. Somebody said earlier, how are we going to get the United States to cede power? Well, who was it? Was it Frederick Douglass who said, power cedes nothing? It's incumbent upon us to claim it. One last thing, you made me think, and Ash made me think from the panel before, because we're involved in the border work, about how we keep talking about it as a humanitarian crisis, but it's a human rights crisis, right? Sure. When it's a humanitarian crisis, we are begging, in the words of a former panelist, we are begging for mercy. We are begging for mercy. We're looking for mercy to solve the problem. When it's a human rights issue, then we are demanding that we're demanding accountability and demanding that government meet its obligations. And I think that one pivot could be very powerful.